What Paul is doing is he is saying that the standard for a man to serve in the office of deacon is faithfulness and fidelity in his marriage relationship. Without boring you too much with the technical details of this passage, this interpretation, I think, fits best with the way that the language is in the original Greek, the way that Paul constructs this linguistically, because the relationship between the words husband and one wife in this verse are a genitive relationship in the Greek, and that's a relationship of quality and not of possession. And so rather than saying a husband who only possesses one wife, I think what Paul is saying is that one wife is a descriptor of the character of the man. He's saying that this man who serves in the office of deacon is a one-woman man. He is a man who practices faithfulness and who practices fidelity in his marriage relationship. And then that seems to fit with the way that Paul structures the rest of his qualifications too, because when Paul wants to give a negative qualification, he's very capable of doing that, and he uses a specific pattern. He uses specific words, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine. But here he constructs his argument or his statement different, and he seems to be trying to give a positive character qualification, not a negative. So instead of saying not someone who's been divorced, he's saying a man who is something, not who's not something. A man who is something, a man who is a one-woman man, a man who practices faithfulness and fidelity in his marriage relationships. And so Paul's really raising the bar higher. And this is a shortcoming that we have. It's a shortcoming that almost all of us have when we approach God's Word. Our tendency really is to take truth from God's Word and form it into the mold of rules to be followed. And if we can check the box, if it fits the rule, then that's good. If it doesn't fit the rule, then that's bad. And we're content to leave it alone, and that's safe. And that's easy, but it's not always right. Now, I will say this for the purposes of our election this morning. It's been the opinion of this church in history past that the proper way to view this passage is to say that divorce disqualifies a man from serving in the office of deacon. That's the way that we're going to approach our election this morning, because that's the way that this church historically has believed. My personal belief is that we need to continue the discussion as we move forward, because there is the possibility that by reducing Paul's words to a rule here, that we can miss the heart of what he's saying. No, it would be possible to elect a man to the office of deacon who has never been divorced, but who's not a one-woman man. It would be possible to elect a man whose life has fit the letter of the rule that we've created, but not the essence of what Paul is saying. Divorce is not always an indicator of fidelity or infidelity. And to remain married for 50 years doesn't mean that you've been faithful. Maybe it just means that there's been one party who's been more committed to the relationship than you've been uncommitted. See, you can be in a marriage relationship and not be a one-woman man. And so there's the possibility that if we just reduce this to a rule, that we could elect somebody to serve in the office of deacon who is not a one-woman man, even though he's never been divorced. And maybe even more dangerous, there's also the possibility that we could shun a man, that we could throw a man away who's always practiced fidelity and faithfulness in his marriage relationships, even though he's been party to a divorce. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to take the heart of God's Word and reduce it to a rule. It's easier, but it's not always right. I think what Paul is saying here raises the bar higher than just let it be somebody who's never been divorced. He's saying make the office of deacon be filled by men who are one-woman kind of men. Men who are faithful in their marriage relationships. Men who practice fidelity. Men who are committed to their wives. Then Paul goes on, the second half of that almost. They have to be husbands of only one wife. And then he says, good managers of their children and their own households. I mentioned earlier that some of these qualifications or characteristics are mirrored between the requirements for overseer and the requirements for deacon, and this is one of those. Paul gives a qualifier when he uses this, good managers of their children and their own households. He gives a qualifier when he uses it as a requirement for the elder or overseer position. He says this, if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? The word manage literally means to stand before. And so Paul says, elect men to the office of deacon who stand before their children and their own households well. You can stand before your household in a couple of different ways, man. You can stand before your household for the purpose of leading them spiritually, and that's what the man's supposed to do. You can stand before your household for the purpose of providing for them and protecting them, in essence, shielding them and being on the front lines for them, and that's what men are supposed to do too. And Paul says, elect men to the office of deacon who stand before their own households well. Men who provide, men who protect, men who lead spiritually. It's important. That's what a deacon is supposed to be, and that's what they're supposed to do. We read through the end of the chapter for a specific reason, and that's because I think those last verses of chapter 3 add a little bit of gravity or a little bit of weight to these characteristics for men who would fill the office of deacon. Paul says, Timothy, I may not be able to come to you, but I want you to know how you're supposed to conduct yourself and how the people that you lead are supposed to conduct themselves as members of the household of God. The household of God, Paul says, is the church of the living God. And it would be great to have time to unpack those two titles because they are very rich with meaning. But Paul then describes the church of the living God as the pillar and the support of truth. I think we miss some of that meaning because we don't live in Ephesus and because we don't walk the streets of Ephesus. But in Ephesus, 250,000 plus people, a lot of them worshiped pagan gods. And so a lot of them had temples that were dedicated to their pagan gods. And there was one temple in particular that maybe Paul had in mind when he used this figurative, metaphorical language. That was the temple of Artemis. The temple of Artemis featured 127 pillars that soared some 60 feet into the air. Those 127 pillars, 60 feet up, supported a roof of stone that was 60% larger than the size of a football field, some 425 feet long, 225 feet wide. When Paul said, Timothy, the church of God it's a pillar and a support for truth, he probably made Timothy think of those pillars that held up the roof of the temple of Artemis or maybe one of those other temples. And Timothy and everybody else knew what would happen if one of those pillars had some kind of structural defect that caused it to fail. Then guess what? That roof could come crashing down and the results would be devastating. It would be traumatic. It would be catastrophic for anybody who was in that temple. Paul says, Timothy, the church of God is a pillar that supports truth. You want to know what that truth is? It's truth about Jesus Christ. Paul gives this hymn that he closes the chapter with, talking about Jesus. He who was revealed in the flesh was vindicated in the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up into glory. That's the truth that the church is holding up. The church functions as a pillar that holds up the weighty truth about who Jesus is. And if you don't conduct yourselves in the right way, if you elect men to the office of overseer and to the office of deacon that aren't qualified, that don't belong there, if you don't take this seriously, then guess what could happen? That pillar could crack, and that pillar could break, and then guess what? That weighty truth about Jesus and His majesty and His glory will come tumbling down. It'll end up trampled in the dirt. There is a sense in which it doesn't matter what we do, the truth about Jesus will remain the same. But there's another sense in which in the eyes of the people out there who don't know Jesus, who've never seen His glory and His beauty and His majesty, if the church falls, then the beauty and the glory and the majesty of Jesus falls with it. And they say, see, I knew there was nothing to that stuff, that Jesus stuff. It's just something that you imagined. It's just something that you created, something that you made up. And that's why this is so important, what we're going to do this morning. That's why we really need to feel the weight of this responsibility, because if we elect men to serve in the office of deacon who aren't qualified, who don't belong there, who shouldn't be there, and guess what could happen? This church as a pillar of truth in this community could develop some cracks. And it might even break, and the truth of Jesus Christ, His beauty and His majesty and His glory could come tumbling down in the eyes of the people who live